Due diligence is the Taco Bell of land work. It's kind of one of those things when you're doing it, and after you've done a couple of them, you get in a good rhythm. But man, if you wait 6 months, it's like, well, what do I do?
We love to get as much lead time as we can, just to organize anything and everything we can. Some of the best ones that we give all of clients, they give us an early heads up.
Just make sure everyone understands your timelines as far as what you're trying to hit, because you might start off somewhere thinking, hey, we got 30 days, but it could change on you quickly depending on what's going on or how many properties you have left to hit. If you can hit that and know what it's going to take to at least reach that, you can typically set yourself up for success.
Land insights, market trends, industry experts. Welcome to the Land Department Podcast, the state of land and energy as we see it.
Right, we're about to talk about diligence. We've got Bryce Winters with us, Kyle Dubiel with us. Should be a fun conversation. We were talking about lunch. Kyle did his diligence, chicken salad. Bryce didn't do his diligence, Taco Bell. What do we have to say for ourselves?
First off, we're too old for that.
Yes.
And second off, do we have to add an intermission? I think we're probably going to have to add an intermission now.
Yeah.
We're making one.
Yeah,
Bryce,
I'm
typically-
just jealous.
I know. Last time I ate Taco Bell, it didn't work out too great for me.
It was an emergency lunch. It's short on options and short on time, so.
Well, not too uncommon from our diligence projects, right?
Right.
Great segue.
Yeah. It's just like diligence. It tastes bad. It's great when you go into it. By the time you're done, you say you'll never do that again.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Due diligence is the Taco Bell of land work. I think that's we should make it.
We should make a shirt.
We should make a t-shirt.
We'll get started on the graphic right away.
Yeah. I'm going to have to write that on my little list here. I got a t-shirt list. Like, it's pretty good.
We'll put a link to the merch in the show notes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Okay, we want to walk through the phases of diligence, right?
Yeah. We've been wanting to do a podcast, and we've talked about doing due diligence podcasts for a while. But frankly, we're probably just too busy doing due diligence to get all the powers that be on the podcast. But it's kind of one of those things. It's when you're doing it, and after you've done a couple of them, you get in a good rhythm. Everything comes naturally. The process flows. You understand what you need to be doing. It gets much easier as you're doing it. But man, if you wait 6 months, it's like, well, what do I do? So the timing was great. We're in a pretty active period in the oil and gas side here at Dudley, at least. And Bryce has been involved with just numerous due diligence jobs for us over the last, especially the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, it's just been hectic. And we had a good rhythm. And I wanted to get someone from the company side, the client perspective, to join us as well, because, we could speak to what we do as brokers. But, even for us, there's, things like we wonder how does it get to this point? What happens before it gets to us? So I reached out to Kyle and suckered him into joining us. And I'm just tickled that he was willing to come on and do it. So yeah, Kyle Dubiel with Eagle Mountain, Williston and Bakken operator, done a couple due diligence with him in the past, and pitched the idea of what we wanted to do, and he was willing to jump in. So Kyle, thanks for joining us, man.
Yeah, no, happy to be here. It's a pleasure and excited to be on it. And we successfully exited our Bakken position, so now we're in Wyoming, and just more due diligence is behind us. So we're just going to see if we can keep it rocking and do some more. But happy to help and looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah. We thought we kind of talked a bunch of different ways about how we might be able to approach this conversation, but it all really boils down to maybe just walking through the process is the easiest way to go. So, maybe Kyle, just maybe give us a rundown of, for you've been in the private equity side, you're looking at deals. Explain how that process works at a basic level. How you're shopping deals, how you're, evaluating assets, who's involved in that process, and maybe we'll just start from there and just work from cradle to grave all the way through closing.
Yeah, absolutely. Just from the beginning, I think it probably starts with the type of deal you're looking at, whether it's unsolicited and you're just trying to work with someone on the side, or if it's a shop deal or a part of a, broader process, maybe with a bank or someone else, and
marketed type
marketed type
deal.
deal. Exactly. And so,
Yeah.
and in either event, you're usually diving in pretty quick on the assets. If it's an unsolicited deal, maybe you've done some stuff in advance and you identify some assets that you like and you kind of pre-scoped it. If it's a marketed deal, you're getting into the data room and then just trying to get your hands on everything and anything you can as early as possible. And so that'll range from the land team to your technical guys, whether it's engineering, geology, reservoir guys, and then of course finance and accounting. So it really does become a kind of all hands on deck type process with everyone kind of getting in the weeds and trying to get familiar with the assets.
Yeah. What types of companies maybe pursue the unsolicited type, methodology or process to find an asset? Do you tend to see certain types of companies or going in, maybe if they're already operating in an area and they're wanting to expand their position, maybe they're doing unsolicited type offers, or is it really just all of the above?
I think it's across the board. Even whether you're small or big, if you see something that someone else has and you like it, our philosophy at Eagle Mountain's always been kind of, why wait? Let's at least see if we can open a discussion and see if someone was interested. I can't speak for everyone, but maybe private equity in general, it's kind of the saying you're always buying, but you're always selling, so we're constantly looking at stuff, but my gosh, if someone comes to us with a really solid offer, we're willing to entertain it. And so if I see the world that way, I like to think that others see it that way too, but not necessarily, it kind of just depends on what that company was set up to do.
So over the years, we worked with, operational teams, people pushing rigs, certain types of landmen on the asset side. And then we work with BD landmen. Is that kind of BD, that BD landman role, is that primarily what they're doing? Are they sourcing trying to sniff out unsolicited opportunities? Is that primarily the type of landman that's doing that work? Unless you're in a small shop where you're having to do everything.
Yeah. I think it also, very much depends on the shop, but very much a BD type role. But some places may not have the luxury of having a BD specific lineman, or an operation specific lineman. You might have someone who does them all. I can say with confidence I do that here for Eagle Mountain. And so, I wear a lot of hats, but whether you're doing it all yourself, you're doing it, as part of a team, there's a lot of communication and kind of a lot you can learn from each other as far as what's going on. You might be in operations and running rigs, et cetera, and hearing stuff from the field level that you're able to communicate to your BD corporate team to, say, hey, look, I heard these people might be doing X, or, field guys are saying they might be selling in a couple of months, see if you can get ahead of a process or not. And so, same thing from the BD side. They might be hearing like, hey, there's a big process going on. How does that impact our field development as far as maybe certain locations we want to target it where we weren't previously kind of eyeing or thinking about? So it kind of all goes hand in hand. But I mean, it all starts with usually a phone call or just trying to make connections, I guess.
Bump into somebody at the landman hangout, sniff it out. So I think, you typically see, the work that we do, there's two types of diligence, right? There's trade diligence where, it's smaller in scope. You're really laser focused on, trading an acreage or whatever the case might be. And then there's, big asset type transactions. And I think for the purposes of our discussion, that's where I think we want to live here. So, so you've sniffed out an opportunity and maybe it's a marketed deal. And you're moving forward, maybe say so on a marketed type transaction, or typically is there like a due date of when bids need to be submitted? Is that kind of how that process works?
Yeah, no, exactly. So usually in a marketed process, they'll give you a calendar of events events, where they'll say, hey, VDR opens on X day. And for those who don't know, a VDR is your virtual data room. So it's like a kind of online portal usually where you can get in and see all the seller's information. So you'll have your VDR.
What's in there?
Help me.
Like what's in a VDR?
Yeah, it's
Good and bad.
It varies.
Generally it's garbage.
Yeah. Some all VDRs are not built equally. I'll say that. Some are definitely better than others. Yeah, you'll typically have at the very least like a lease schedule, a well schedule or exhibit. Reserves for the engineering team to run, maybe certain material contracts, financials. Kind of, it usually starts pretty high level, and then you're typically given like a Q&A opportunity where as you're digging into the assets, you can ask specific questions. We try and solicit some answers to get more information. But generally it'll kind of cover your main groups, as far as engineering, land, finance, regulatory, legal, etc.
Yeah. And so that Q&A process, is that typically like everybody who's bidding on it gets on a call and you can ask your questions, or is it more one-off and you present your questions and they give you specific answers?
It's typically both. And so what they'll do, like they'll allow you to ask specific Q&A questions, like submit it directly and then, solicit your answers, from the sellers. But usually part of the calendar when you're soliciting deals, or not soliciting deals, when you're part of the marketing process, they'll set up basically a PowerPoint presentation where you can go in and the sellers will actually present to you, whether it's their board or their BD team or, certain individuals, that specialize in the different functions, and kind of pitch the deal to you. And so you can hear from them directly and then be able to ask them questions as well. So we typically, at least at Eagle Mountain, try to take advantage of both, trying to learn as much as we can about the assets in the limited time that we have.
Yeah. What's that timeline generally look at? Are we looking at 30 days, 60-day window? I mean, what do you tend to see there? I know it tends to happen pretty quickly when it happens, but
yeah, I think that definitely varies too. But I think the most typical is probably anywhere from 30 to 45 days. We've seen some go as long as 60 days. Maybe depends on the asset size and how long it may take to, realistically review what you need to review. But I'd say probably anywhere from 30 to 45 days is your typical timeline between, like VDR open day and then bid day.
Yeah. So on the land side of things, we've seen all forms of VDR rooms. I mean, typically it's like the first thing we're complaining about.
Yeah.
But there are noticeably some that are better than others. Much more organized, others, obviously you can look at it and say, man, this thing was thrown together, or there's some things that you can glean from what you see in that VDR. So Kyle, when you're looking at a VDR from a land perspective, right? We've seen good and bad. What are some of the things that, you're looking for to clue you into the condition of the asset, how great your records might be once you get into a diligence phase? Or is the condition of the VDR from a land perspective not super important in that pre-PSA, bidding time window?
Yeah, so typically in the VDR, and not always, but it starts pretty limited. So you'll get your lease schedule, but you can learn a lot pretty quickly just from the lease schedule. I mean, I've seen lease schedules that don't even give you the gross acres and net acres on a lease basis, and they'll just give you a sum. And so you're a little limited on being able to kind of dive in and see like, hey, in this county they have X acres, or with these wells they have, this many acres, et cetera. And so the more detailed that lease schedule, the easier that land due diligence is going to be. And sometimes you got to ask for additional questions or for additional information. Hey, can you add some columns to this so I could get a little more familiar with what you had? Whether it's fee lands or federal lands or, BIA lands. Is it HBP? Is it non-producing? Little things like that can really help you during your due diligence. But, from there, from the land side, if you in the VDR can actually get, copies of leases or certain contracts, et cetera, I typically say that's a win, and it's really helpful and usually helps
Yeah.
your bid. Sometimes sellers are reluctant to give you that or access to that level of detail until you actually have your PSA signed. And so a lot of times your deep land due diligence happens once you sign the PSA, and then they kind of open the kimono a little bit and show you like, okay, here's all our leases, here's our contracts, et cetera.
Yeah.
But there are,
Yeah.
I will say, from a material contracts perspective, you definitely need to be able to review the seller's contracts before you sign the PSA, because there's a lot in those contracts that you need to be aware of before you put ink to paper to possibly not necessarily bind yourself into a deal, but put down a deposit and get things moving.
Do you say that typically that those material contracts are available during that bid window for you to, because I would think it would have a pretty big effect on potentially what you're willing to pay for an asset.
They should be, yeah. And if they're not,
Yeah.
I always ask for them. And,
Yeah.
it varies depending on what people may say is material, but I go as far as say, like, hey, JOAs are material, farm mounts are material, development agreements are material, things like that.
Yeah.
Anything that can affect the value of the assets or possibly the interest of the assets, or there are certain obligations that have to be met, or your interest deteriorates or, gets cut. Are there certain, carries or farm outs that, hey, up to a certain point, you get X interest, but afterwards it goes down to Y.
Yeah.
All of that impacts your value and are all material considerations to the deal, because it all flows through what the actual value of the assets are. So as far as like important steps for land due diligence, and that kind of coincides with legal as well. They typically like to get eyes on this.
Yeah. That's step one.
Yeah,
That's
I would
the big
say
one. And
contracts is huge.
yeah, that's one of the big things, big picture that we tend to see defects. So Bryce, Kyle's kind of walked us through what he has access to at the company
Yes, sir.
level as they're working up to that bid process. We tend to come in, right after that. Say Kyle and his team have bid on an asset and they're moving forward into PSA negotiations, right? They're the high bidder. I want to get some insight from you on, you see certain things in the VDR for that bid process, but typically the first thing we're asking for is like, where's this? How could you get me that? I need more information on my lease schedule, this, that, and the other. What are some of those things that you see that you tend to always have to request, or that is generally readily available beyond that bid window through your VDR?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty much all of it. We never get the full picture pre-PSO. We're always struggling to find all the appropriate schedules to do what we need to do. A tremendous amount of work needs to be put in, almost pre-diligence, to schedule everything and set up our workflows and really understand the size of the asset and then how much of it we're going to have to review to get into flows for you guys. So, we love to see all the PSA schedules, even if they're draft copies, so we can start trying to figure out, are there 100 wells, are there 200 wells, are there 300 wells, and how do you guys determine your allocated value? Is it, what does your 80-20 split look like? Is it 100 wells out of 800 wells, or is it, an even split across everything? And, those things really help us just start trying to conceptualize the team size and the amount of effort we're going to need to do into the different parts of the diligence to achieve y'all's objectives and hopefully find you guys some recordable defects and get you at a comfort level with that stuff.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. So, I mean, one of the most important things is that organizational phase. Like that first week is critical. And, there's always a lot of back and forth on, hey, can you give me this? Do I have access to this? What your schedules look like? Let's back up a little bit and talk about when the optimal time to reach out to your broker or your diligence team, whether it's internal, if you're going to do it internal with your shop, or if you're going to outsource it to a brokerage shop. What's the sweet spots there, Kyle? Like, when do you kind of start to feel like you want to start reaching out to your team?
Yeah, I'd say, let's say, again, with a marketed process, you get to the point where a bid date comes and you get word or notified, hey, you're the winning bidder, we're going to move forward. It's depending on what the seller asks for. You may have already provided them a draft of the PSA agreement or whatever sales agreement you're going to utilize. Or you've provided typically like an issues list of some material terms that you want to address, and then you negotiate the PSA. It's probably at that point where it becomes very real and said, all right, we're moving towards inking a purchase and sale agreement. We need to get ready for due diligence. So when this is signed, we're off and running. And so that's typically when I reach out. If not, where it's looking like we're getting some positive feedback, et cetera. I like to give, you guys, brokers, whoever it would be, helping with the due diligence enough time so where they know, like, hey, this is the amount of acreage we have. This is the number of leases. This is the contracts. These are the wells. This is the area that we're in. Because that scoping is so vital and important to your due diligence timeline and be able to make sure you hit all your achievables that you need to hit during the process. So definitely, I'd say for me, there's probably that window when you're negotiating that PSA, maybe 2 weeks before you sign, that you really need to loop guys like you in to say, all right, here's what we're looking at, and does this align with meeting certain deadlines, because you also need to know, like, how big of a team are you going to have, and so you guys need to know, hey, do I have 10 people, 20 people, 30 people available to be able to work on this project?
Yeah. Bryce, talk about some of that. What's your optimal, like in the best case scenario, when do you want heads up? What are some of the things you need to know early on to help form a team or start to build a framework?
Some of the best ones that we get involved with clients, they give us an early heads up. Say, hey, I'm working on a diligence. It's going to be a 30-day, PSA diligence window. We want to, look at X, Y, and Z, start, conceptualizing what that's going to look like for us as we get further down on negotiations. And then, week out, whatever it looks like, when they get a better understanding, or they enter some level of exclusivity, or they, narrow down the approved, potential buyers to, top 3 or whatever that looks like when you go out next phase of negotiations. We love to get as much lead time as we can, just to organize anything and everything we can. All of that stuff, just, a skeleton crew, 2 through 5 people, high level, just getting everything organized and put together, setting up our crew. So when we get 100% green light, we don't skip a beat. We're ready to roll and make early gains on that. We have certain things that we know that are easily achievable at the beginning of the diligence, and we like to just have everything ready to go when we get the green light, to get that done as quickly as possible, get out of the way.
Yeah. So I think that's the biggest thing, especially in times when it's busy, right? All pretty fortunate in the oil and gas space right now. It's pretty busy, even though oil prices are low. Oftentimes that's when you see transactions, right? And so we're seeing a lot of that. So when you're in high peak broker activity times, when you're talking to all your broker buddies and they're saying, man, we're busy, the more lead time they need, right? And, factors are, what type of crew am I going to need? Is this going to be a largely PDP kind of deal where I'm going to need heavier on more of those in-house type diligence people? Or do I have some term leasehold where I'm going to need to be doing more title, more field-oriented diligence? Like, all those things are important for us to know where it's at, where the sellers are. We're going to have a good VDR. Do we need to have people positioned in a certain city to access a company's files? You don't see that very often anymore, but it's a factor. Sometimes you got to get in their office, right? So all those things are pretty critical.
At least the state and county, so we can start figuring out what the online resources look like. So we've got to know whether we got to send people to field. I mean, parts of it will have to be done in the field, and we can accommodate that. But if we're going to need a large crew in courthouse or backing up on a remote team, we need to know that pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Bryce, I'd love to hear from you, because I know everyone comes to you 30 days in advance. They're gracious and they come to you with like the most perfect buttoned up due diligence job.
Can you please help me? Can you please help me?
I'd love to hear from you. Like, well, one, what's the shortest amount of time you've been given? But also, what are the types of pressures that puts on you? Like, walk us through that logistically to really understand what's going on in your world when someone comes to you with like barely any time.
Yeah, fortunately times are good, and we can be a little more selective about, diving off at a really bad one. And we know our limitations. And some of the biggest challenges, having a really honest conversation with a client about, you've got X amount of time. What can we actually get done? What do we feel like we can get done during that window of time? Is it 30 days we can get a lot done? Is it a week? Yeah, we're going to have to figure out everything we can. It'll cut some corners and give you some impact for it. But really, until we can actually study what's in the VDR, study what's been provided to you, there are things that we can do that are minimal to give you some impact within a short window. But really, we had a crazy one come. We had 4 days to get it done, and we had to turn it down because there was nothing impactful we could do to that. But that hit this last week. Some of them I've had 30, 60 days of pre-PSA opportunity because client, the arranger of the deal, and they had a good understanding what was going on. And we almost done with the due diligence before they signed a PSA. We just had a little bit of stuff to clean up on the tail end and stuff. Ideally, the more we could do pre-PSA, we hate to waste your money, but if you have a good understanding that, you're going to be given the opportunity to buy this and we can do as much as we can, it's great. The last thing that's really, really impactful is for us to have an honest conversation about how much money you want to spend on due diligence. Are you buying a $50 million deal or a $500 million deal? A $50 million deal and you go, spend a ton of money on due diligence, it doesn't always make sense. But if you're doing a giant one and we could throw everybody we can and it can give you a lot of value and look at everything and make you feel really comfortable, we love the opportunity to do that. So.
Yeah. Kyle, from your side, what causes it to be such a short window? Like why are people coming to Bryce with like 4 days?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it depends on, how quickly that deal was really formulated or maybe what pressures are on either the seller or the buyer. Is there a certain reason why the seller needs to close quickly or, vice versa? Is there a certain reason why the buyers are, hey, we have to get this done sooner rather than later to ensure we get the assets as opposed to somebody else? And so it could be an array of reasons. I'd like to think, I'm trying to think back on my history. I don't know that I've ever needed a 4 day, thank goodness. Because I sometimes I think, gosh, 30 days is pushing it, but 30 days is pretty typical, pretty marked to it. But
do you ever find a scenario where you're one of the top bidders and you're not selected to move forward and something falls through during that diligence period where you're invited back in? There's an opportunity to jump back in on it, and that shortens the window for you.
Yeah, and that happens all the time. And if you're the second place bid and you get the chance to move up to the first place, then certainly you're willing to do certain things to be able to help put yourself in the right position to be able to take advantage of the opportunity that was given to you, because you don't always get it. And so, the sellers might ask you like, hey, look, we previously we're doing a 45-day due diligence, moving it to 30, or, hey, we're on a short window instead of 30, we'll give you 21, and there are definitely circumstances that could accelerate the timeline. And that's when you really just need to have that conversation that Bryce was mentioning earlier. Like, hey, this, from a company perspective, this is what I'm trying to achieve. This is what's important to me. And you would hope for that honesty, that Bryce mentioned, of having that conversation and then being realistic as far as, hey, yeah, that we can hit those timelines or not. Or maybe we're not the best ones for this project because, you want to make sure that you can meet the objectives that you have for yourself. And so it's really important for both sides to be on the same page. And, that's why scoping is so important as far as, how many properties you have and, what do the values look like for your allocated values? Because everyone knows that golden rule. We've probably all heard it. Typically, 80% of the value is derived from 20% of the properties. And so if you can hit that and know, hey, what it's going to take to at least reach that, you can typically set yourself up for success. but there's a lot that goes into account to be able to make that determination.
Yeah. One of the things that, Bryce touched on, the project and deal circumstances oftentimes dictates the type of diligence you need to do, right? And that's some of the questions we ask, do you have insurance? Are we going to have to, is there going to have to be a product that is insurance quality? We're going to have to pretty this thing up. What's your 80% of the value, which is typically what we strive to clear. Most diligences, we're pushing to get 80% of the value cleared in some shape, form, or fashion. And that's a difficult conversation at times. What's this process going to look like, and what's the associated cost? Oftentimes, Bryce and I will get a call, and we start talking through diligence, and you can tell the layman knows what they're talking about. They want to do this. We want to check that. We need to check that. We need y'all to do this. Well, by the time you start adding up 10 different scope items, you got a $150,000 bill in 30 days. And, when we lay that to them, they're like, oh, well, we only want to spend 60. And they were like, okay. Well, and that's fine. It's totally within, that's information we need to know.
Yeah.
All right, you want to spend 60 on diligence? Okay. Now let's back up and talk about what's going to be the most valuable 60 grand that we can spend on this, right? To clear the deal. And so that's always something we advise our clients to do, is like, when you call us, have an understanding of what you really want and how this deal is structured, and know how much you want to spend, because you can, to Bryce's point, you can throw a pile of people and you can diligence perpetually, right?
Yeah.
You got to keep in mind, we're trying to do something in 30 days that it took a company years to put together. So, those are critical questions. Let's move on to, all right, we placed a bid, right? I want to talk a little bit about allocation of value, because I think that's a big part of what, like, Bryce and his determines how Bryce would organize his team. Kyle, at what point in time are you guys working on an AOV schedule?
I would say
in this process,
yeah, you have a pretty good understanding of what your allocated values are when you make your bid. Because your bid's going to derive from, hey, these properties are worth X, and for each specific property you have the value associated with it. It's really set in stone, through your PSA exhibit. Whenever you guys finalize that with the seller, you both agree, buyer and seller, that each of these properties, and it literally lists each of the properties, whether it's wells or leases or units or whatever it may be, this is the value that we're going to assign to it. And that's really what you use to base, all of your defects off of. And so it's probably one of the more important exhibits as far as the whole process, to really kind of set the stage for the project you're about to embark on.
Is that allocation of value shared with the seller?
Yes. Yeah.
Or is that an internal buyer?
Well, yeah. The buyer might have a slightly different view of what that allocated value is, but generally, the value that you bid is going to be based on that allocated value schedule. Okay. And yeah, typically the buyer provides that to the seller, and the seller will look at it and decide, like, hey, yeah, that's kind of on par with how we feel about it. But at the same time, the buyer's going to pay what they want to pay. And so the seller may not always agree with every single line item on there, but they'll generally kind of give you some feedback, yay or nay, or like, hey, if it's a PDP deal, why are you allocating so much value to locations, or vice versa? And so sometimes there's conversations had about that. But it's really just meant to avoid gamemanship, as far as like, hey, we're going to assign a long value to this one property because maybe we'll find defects. Ideally, you don't want situations like that, especially if you're the seller.
So AOV is originated from the buyer, reviewed, and essentially endorsed by AOV is assigned originally by the seller, and then it's reviewed and endorsed by the buyer.
No, you had it right. It's basically set by the buyer and then reviewed and signed off on by the seller. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And then once that PSA signed, it's a done deal. It's locked in, and now you move forward.
Yeah, that schedule is locked in, and then that's what that's what is the basis of all your defects moving forward.
Okay. So Bryce,
Yeah,
you get an
I wanted
AOP
to ask this
schedule.
question, like, what about the financing piece and how that brings in another allocation of value schedule? Sometimes, often we'll see, the buyer's AV schedule, but then there's a separate bank one in the background that we're trying to help juggle and match to. And how much does that affect? How much does the financing piece affect the negotiation of all of that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Bryce, and it's something that you as a company and then your brokers need to be aware of from the beginning, because it's possible that your buyer AV with the seller is going to look different than your bank AVs, and maybe not always, but let's say the bank might give you more value for producing properties versus unproducing properties, whereas you as the buyer are allocating you certain values to undeveloped or unproducing properties. Probably the better way to say is undeveloped properties, where you're going to have locations. And so it's going to change the scope as far as what you need to hit from the company side, but then also make sure you can get your bank comfortable with on your debt financing side. Because your credit agreement with your bank, if you're financially part of the deal, they're going to want to make sure and see, like, hey, due diligence was done on all of these properties that we have an allocated value to, or typically at least up to 80 or 90%, whatever you agree to in your credit facility. So the last thing you want to happen is you're moving forward with your buyer seller AV, and the bank gives you their allocated value schedule later as far as how they valued, the properties. And then you're scrambling with a week or two left saying, hey, we got to get due diligence done on X more number of properties or wells, leases, et cetera, to make sure we can get the bank comfortable, by closing.
Yeah. Yeah. Bryce, let's talk about the importance of, it starts with that AB schedule.
Yeah.
All right, when you get that AB schedule, what's the first thing that you're doing from an organizational standpoint that kind of sets things in motion for the ultimately being able to get done within the 20-day window that essentially we have to do our work in a 30-day diligence?
Yeah, to us, it's what is the value allocated to? Is it wells? Is it leases? Is it units? Or something else? So we look at that first, and that kind of dictates how we organize information and how we start structuring what our workflow is going to look like. Is allocating value done on a single well or a unit that's a number of wells? Makes a big difference to us. Or is it purely a lease, or is it a mineral deal? How do we need to hydrate our efforts? And then from there, it doesn't always happen, but most of the time clients will let us actually see the allocated value on a line item by line item schedule, and we'll go in and start doing the math and double checking the math and making sure if it's 80-20 or the bank requires 90% or 95%, that we've organized and we'll work through this from a top-down perspective. And from there, it's tying all the different pieces of the schedules together. If it's a well-based diligence for the files organized by units, we have to have some sort of organizational crossover. What leases go to what wells, which go to what units. It's building out kind of a master workbook of information that we can use to flow everything. And when we say he's got a 10% variance on a working interest on a well, what all is impacted by that? And how is that affected?
Yeah. Yeah. So how do you, this is all happening, that kind of first step, that organizational step is happening really week one, right? Once you've got that organized and you understand, all right, we're going to have to do 22, DSUs worth of diligence here. What's your recommended process for a traditional diligence where we're not doing like acquisition title opinions or anything like that? Kind of what's the next step?
Yeah, for any diligence, we all kind of start, and I say a 5-finger approach to every due diligence. It's a leading to cover shut. It's a well production review. It's looking at leases for, consensus provides honors provisions. It's material contracts, and then tying it all up and doing the working interest and NRI confirmation. And so any of that, some of those things go really quickly. A lien encumbrance requires sending someone to all of the courthouse or all the courthouses. I've had one with 20 or 30 courthouses that were part of the deal before. I've had a single courthouse for due diligence and figure out how to logistically handle covering that. That happens really quickly. with, state regulatory websites and inverse access, we can start hitting the production review really hard. The next thing we really have to do is we have to really dive into the provided information, find all of the title takeoffs. Are we updated with title opinions? Are we updated from some brokers or some sort of title ownership reports? Or is there no title? We're just going to have to do some sort of a sovereign run to get the client comfortable with what title piece of that is. So that's the biggest part of the organizational piece of that is figuring out what takeoff title we have. We're binding and hurting. There are layers of folders. We've got room right now where everything is organized in Access. They're giant Access database. We put that in a cloud. Some people have problem getting it. Some people have never used Access. Can we find somebody that can start downloading every information out of Access and putting in files that maybe or other parts of our team work on? So that's the very beginning of it. That's really our primary focus. After that, it's mass chaos. It's a lot of moving parts. It's people touching all kinds of different things, and it all comes together at the end somehow or another. It all comes together at the end.
So there's we've touched on the kind of just some determining factors of how you build your crew out. And we can dive into that. So if you've got an all PDP deal, largely you're going to have title opinions. You're going to have, well files with JIV and Reg Dex. You can have some access to some accounting and pay and revenue, expensive revenue tracking. If it's undeveloped acreage, if you got term leasehold, right? That's a whole different type of crew. Sometimes you'll have a blend. Dive into, how you structure your team based on the type of asset it is. Or if you have a say a PDP and a term leasehold scenario, how do you tackle that?
Yeah, I messed up on that 5-figure thing. The fifth piece of that stuff, the 14 digits that are out, is material contracts. That's the thing that we put a huge emphasis on. And the bulk of our defects are found in consistent reference in contracts. I mean, that's where almost everything comes from. It's rare to find a title defect these days. Almost everything comes out of, something in a material contract that's RS or a back end that wasn't scheduled or a pref route that you didn't know about that somebody can exercise and take some value off it.
No, we can kind of dive into that a little more. I think what's the reason why we tend to see most of our defects nowadays be on those consent pref rights or material contract type stuff? It's Kyle, most of the time it's because of the value of the coverage, like a contract can affect a whole DSU, right?
Yeah.
How does that kind of come into play? We talk about your defect thresholds and, those kind of, you got to have a big defect most times now to really hit that defect threshold. Maybe kind of explain how those defect thresholds are hit and, why you can have those types of defects be the only things that really hit it.
Yeah. And so just for those who are listening that maybe don't know exactly what a threshold is or what a deductible is, these are set values in your PSA that are, a dollar value that you have to be able to hit value wise before you can even allege that defect. So, the first one is your threshold. If it doesn't hit a value equal to or greater than, that impact to your interest on that property, you won't be able to assert it per the title threshold. The other important one is your title defect deductible. And so that, if you kind of think about it like a car insurance deductible, it's the amount that you're going to have to eat before you can actually recover a reduction in the purchase price. So as an example, and that's typically, a percentage, or, if you take a percentage times the deal value, you give your title deductible value. So an easy example would be, let's say you have a threshold of $50,000, but your deductible is $3 million. You wouldn't be able to assert a threshold until you're over or equal to typically that $50,000. And then to see an actual reduction on purchase price, you won't be able to assert any of those thresholds or those title defects until all of those defects that are above that threshold equal your deductible. And so if it's $3 million, you can see how many it would take to get to that point. And not all of them are going to be $50,000. Some of them might be 500,000, some might be $1 million. You get there quick, but typically, they're going to be in the 50, 100, whatever range, kind of around there, and it starts to compound. But from a contract perspective, that's kind of where you see some of your bigger ones, because it typically has a bigger impact as far as maybe affecting multiple properties, et cetera. But you got to be really careful in your PSA, because attorneys are smart. And so they have certain carve outs for what qualifies as a title defect, or possibly a title defect exception, or what's a permitted encumbrance. And a lot of times nowadays, they're trying to build in language that prevents defect stacking. So as an example, let's say you have 3 wells in a DSU, and you have a defect where you lost a lease that is applicable to that DSU, and you might have 3 wells in that DSU. They won't let you stack it, across multiple ones unless you clearly kind of stipulate in your PSA that that's allowed, so it has to be on each individual property. And so you just got to be careful and make sure that your brokers are aware of, hey, what are your title defect exceptions and what are your permitted encumbrances? And so for any not title attorney, but really any attorney and the landman listening to this, it's important for them to work closely together to kind of set those and understand what's in that agreement, so what you should be chasing and when you might be chasing ghosts, because you can't allege it anyway. But yeah, I mean,
that's a good point.
Pref rights, those are typically handled in the PSA, where if something is, someone executes a pref right in advance, it's kind of handled as a separate PSA line item. Hey, either the seller gets to keep it and the property is removed, or the buyer gets the money but the property is removed, or it's handled after the fact. So it's really just a timing thing. But consents will really get you, because if you're not aware of what your consents are, specifically hard consents, and you don't get that prior to the deal closing, and whoever had that consent ability didn't consent and says, hey, per the term of my lease or this contract or whatever it is, this assignment's null and void, you just took a massive impact to your property value.
Yeah. And that's there's an important component there, Bryce, maybe to touch on is, you have scheduled, material contracts, right? Which will oftentimes have your consents. But that schedule is just what the seller's telling you. How important is it for you to do an independent analysis as a diligence team?
Yeah, it's important. We typically include it in our, we like to sort of consider the preferred schedule from the PSA, and we incorporate it into our work. And we do the full confirmation if all of those are existing, and we concur that those are consents and preference. But then we create a secondary schedule for additional consents and preference that we find in contracts and leases or anywhere else in the package. And we provide that to you guys in the grants. Typically we'll do it that way, during our diligence window. So you hopefully have enough time to get to work on those consents. So as we're looking at those, we always do the best we can to interpret whether they're a hard consent or soft consent or something in between, just so the gravity of their involvement and how they can affect one of your assets that you're trying to acquire.
Yeah. Bryce, you talked about, I want to kind of go back to that process and kind of that, I guess it's 6-finger approach.
It's really
never
fun.
ending.
Yeah, it's really fun. And I spent the 2 hours before this call buried in spreadsheets, working on some stuff for due diligence, and my mind is fixated on this one thing, getting it right on the interest calculation for this one deal stuff.
Really, no, it's all good, man.
It's a feasible.
It's a complicated. Yeah, it's a complicated process, right? And one thing I always tell clients when they call us, I was like, well, first and foremost, every due diligence is different. We get asked all the time, how do you go about due diligence? I was like, well, show me your asset, show me your deal, and I'll tell you how we do it. Let's kind of step back to, there's 4 or 5 things that are happening all at once, as a team. And I'm just putting our field, our broker hat on.
Yeah.
Right. We got people doing consent review. We've got the organizational effort. We've got maybe a field title component. We've got lien encumbrance. We've got well file review. Walk through, Dudley, we do in most diligence products include a due diligence worksheet.
Yeah.
Kind of talk through, the importance of a DDW, and how, we'll have maybe 4 or 5 different teams working on something and how that comes together ultimately so you can sit down and review everything that pertains to your well or your unit at once to ultimately be able to determine if you have a defect.
Yeah. Our information is usually organized in 2 ways. We'll have a master workbook. It's just a multi-tab worksheet of all of the asset information from the deal. But behind that, on high value assets, either units or wells, we put together what's called the due diligence workbook. Something with due diligence sheets, but due diligence workbook is what we call it. And it's, again, a multi-tabbed kind of workbook. We conceptualize it as kind of, if you're buying this asset and you're going to have to move it to operating really quickly, this can kind of be your takeoff for your team to use. That's a high level summary with multiple tabs behind that gets into the details of everything that's involved in the asset. It's, here are the wells that are involved. Here's how we see it. Here's any production gaps. We check for PPQ, all the other things that are relevant. Here are the 10 or 20 leases that are associated with that. A brief lease analysis, expirations, rentals, all the things that you would want to see. Maybe some
That's where
audits.
you're
And then
you're gathering your consent notice of assignment stuff.
all the contracts that have bearing on that asset or that grouping of assets. These 5 JOAs are involved in it. There's a farm in, a farm out, blah, 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 blah. And then title.
Here's your
last
title
piece.
opinions.
And then the
Here's your
title's the
title
last piece.
opinions.
And it's kind of a title summary that structures what title opinions you have, kind of how we see it, any major title defects, and then just a brief focused run sheet of everything that we see that's happened since that title opinion was rendered. Limited, with some limitations to, sellers or certain depths that are material to the deal. So that diligence worksheet is kind of everything that we knew. And so taking back a step, the structure of our team typically is a blend of, of course, Dudley leadership, but it's a blend of former in-house or high-level CPL or JD type landmen that are used to working more of an in-house environment, that understand, the structure of a unit, a well, and how the wells play in and the contracts and how it all fits together, as if they were somebody that was going to manage this asset for one of our clients and wells companies. And then, we'll have some title landmen that are better than the records, that are focused on taking their title and updating and looking for issues related to that. And looking at, lease clauses and some of the things that we see, and we deal more with on the field side of things. And so we kind of divide and conquer. One landman will do a lot of the, it's easy for one landman to get in and just bang out all the well review, looking for gaps, looking for PPQ issues, build that into a schedule that someone can work off of later. We'll spread out all the title review. We'll kick it out to as many agents as we need. As the reports come in, we feed them up into those workbooks. And then I kind of like to give a DDW to one of my in-house type landmans and say, treat this like this is yours. Treat this as like you're working for a client. This is an asset you're going to be responsible for. I want you to go and look for anything that you find that's a problem. As if you were going to operate this, you have to take it to your boss and take it to wrong thing. And so as it all comes together, it kind of feeds up, and it feeds up in our master spreadsheet. And that's what we can give our client kind of a global look at everything we're finding, sort of a filterable, and then a way to quantify any variances or defects that we find, and a quick look. And then they have these workbooks in a folder in the cloud with all the supporting information, so they can take that and onboard and run it quickly. It may take a month to get the seller files into your system, or whatever that looks like as you put it into your regular workflows.
Yeah. So one thing to expand on there in that workbook, that cover sheet, that due diligence workbook, is we're incorporating the allocated value of the wells that are in that DSU. So we're taking that, stated working interest, stated acreage, stated allocated value, and we're referencing that. We're also, below that is, have we identified a defect or a deficiency, right? This is how much value we, have reviewed and opined to, that this asset is worth. And then if there is a defect or a variance or a deficiency or whatever the case might be, we're going to detail that out. At that point, that's when it goes to Kyle's desk, right? Kyle, you get a due diligence workbook or you get a defect notice from your team. What are you doing? Like, what's the first step when it comes to maybe analyzing that defect to determine, hey, let's look a little more. Maybe you've got some knowledge that you've gained by working the area or through your due diligence process. Like, how do you kind of navigate that? You've got a potential defect or deficiency from your team. Where does it go from there?
Yeah, I would say, that spreadsheet is so vital to the company's standpoint at just keeping everything organized and being able to, see that much information in one single spot, because there's a lot that went into that, as Bryce mentioned, leases, title, contracts, right-of-ways, et cetera, applicable wells. And so from the company perspective, for me to be able to get that and see kind of a zoned in view without having to click through, 300 documents, et cetera, and still meet your timelines is essential. So, I'll say that first and foremost. And so, when I get it, hopefully it's not identifying a title discrepancy, and if it's not, then you have a wonderful workbook that you'll be able to utilize for the life of the asset and just reference as a quick, kind of, hey, this is, even if these are the wells associated, with this DSU, but then under this DSU, here are all the contracts tied to it, without maybe having to go find each individual contract and do that work to figure it out, because maybe the seller's files are good enough to be able to tell you that maybe they're not that organized. And so having these is extremely useful. But if it comes up and says, hey, look, we did this review, we've identified this contract, or the fact that through this title review, it doesn't look like they were ever assigned this leasehold and the seller is claiming it. From there, I would contact Bryce or whoever and kind of do a deeper dive and be like, okay, are we absolutely sure? Can we check X, Y, Z? Double check the math and then use that against the PSA to say, okay, is this a legitimate defect? How much of an interest impact is it that ultimately affects your value? And does it hit your thresholds and deductibles? And if it does, then, you work together to draft your defect notice and let the seller know. Sometimes your relationship with your seller is probably going to be pretty good. And so it might even give you an opportunity to say, hey, look, I'm showing X on this defect. Do you have anything that helps fix this?
What am I missing here?
Yeah, maybe weren't included in the files you gave me or might be buried somewhere and get a little bit more information. And most of the time they do. And then you're able to kind of take that, give it back to Bryce and say, okay, look, hey, this is what I'm seeing. I think this might cure it without, actually having to ask the seller to cure anything, et cetera, and to kind of run through it that way.
Yeah.
There are circumstances
I think that's
where you do have to assert a title defect and you work through that process. But
I think that's an important thing to note. To keep in mind, you have to be cognizant of the pressure you're putting on, and the ask you're putting on your team, right? Hey, find something wrong with this thing in, 4 days that took 2 years to put together, right? And so you can't have your diligence team. There's the fine line, Bryce, about, letting your diligence team just grind and grind and grind on something versus, hey, we're going to do an analysis. We're going to pull everything together. Does it pass the smell test? Are we looking for the basics? And then be able to move on, because at some point you just got to move on. And that relationship, Kyle, that you have is super critical. And you got to understand that, hey, you're going to get something from your team. It may have what we identified deficiencies, which are just something doesn't smell right, something's a little off, but I don't think it's like critical, versus an actual something we say, hey, this is a big time bust, it's black and white. Those deficiencies, and even defects that may come from the field, working through that with your seller is super critical. And I think I can't stress enough probably the importance of maintaining that relationship and rapport from your perspective with your seller, because they're going to be the key to a lot of your answers,
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's super, super critical, to be able to capture that. So, Bryce, we talked about the kind of added value, and Kyle, you hit on it as well. It's like you want and that product is critical, right? Do we slam through this thing because you only got 60 grand to spend, or if we spend a little more time, and this can even happen at sometimes, Bryce, I know we've done this post close, where it's like, all right, we're going to run through this thing because we have a short time window, but you want to be able to roll into development quickly, as a buyer, if we spend an extra 2 weeks on the back end of this deal for an extra 40 grand or whatever to keep this team engaged while you have them. I think that's one of the biggest things we stress to our clients is like, when we give you a team, you've got 6 or 8 or 10 people potentially at your disposal. Make the most of it, right? So oftentimes we'll go through on the back end and put that nice big due diligence workbook together that serves as less of a due diligence product and more of a prep and, teeing up a unit or a DSU for your ops team, right? To where you can say, all right, we want to roll into this DSU. Here's the Dudley report or the diligence report that's got all those things. So there's a couple of different ways to kind of approach that depending on your timelines, how much you want to spend on diligence, access to your team, maybe how big your team is internally, Kyle. If you're a 2-man shop, you want to get the most out of that diligence team because when they're gone, they're gone. So that's always something that we really emphasize early on is what do you want to get out of this? And anymore, it's rare that a deal's going to get defected to the point that it doesn't close. Right. I mean, it's just, that's the fact of the matter is these things are going to close. So, get out of the mentality of we're going to bust this deal and kill it and understand that, hey, this is an organizational effort just as much as it is a diligence effort, so that you can act quickly on the back end.
And a lot of it plays into the quality of the records of self-reliance and what you're going to take on after that and how rigorous they are, how easy it is to find what you need. Is it just a big data dump, or are they organized by assets that you guys could work through quickly? If it's a big data dump, there's a lot we can do during the diligence period with some administrative help for even post GSI or post flows where we can help set you up for success with it and what was asset that will steer early. So,
yeah.
Yeah, I'll tell you guys, you guys have done due diligence for Eagle Mountain before, and I've used these spreadsheets through the life of, the asset, whether it was development or just quick references or trying to get a better understanding of maybe how the previous seller acquired the interest, if you have to go back and look at something. But, after your due diligence is done and you're gearing towards closing, that's phase one, of now owning and operating assets. And then you're moving on to, okay, well, now we got to get these assets set up in the system. And those spreadsheets are, awesome tool for your back office team, your land administration, your lease analysts, your JIB accountants, revenue accountants, et cetera, to be able to utilize and just double check that whatever the seller was giving you as far as data extracts or what might be in their files is matching up, with what the due diligence is reporting. Especially there are going to be times where maybe you're not able to assert a defect because of the threshold or deductible, but that doesn't mean that something may not be right.
There's not a problem.
System. And so moving forward, you want to make sure that you have the information that you need to correct it in the system. So you're not setting yourself, behind the 8 ball moving forward when you then become the operator or start developing the property. So,
yeah. Well, I think we've walked through the entire process. There's tons of, I think the one thing that we can all agree on is that we only scratch the surface. You can really get in the weeds. There's a lot of work that happens to bring these things together. The big takeaway is try to have a long-term mentality in your diligence. Think about how can I use this product or this resource or this team, post-close. Be deliberate about, documenting your information, deliberate about your team. Give your broker and your team as much heads up as possible. I think especially in busy times, it takes, half of Bryce and I's job today is logistics. Who do we have coming off of what job? Give your broker as much information as you can about the asset, where it's at, how big it's going to be, What's the structure of the deal, so that they can be thinking. The greatest thing about giving your team a heads up is that they think for free. You're not paying them on the clock, right? I mean, get that free time, have it wheeling around in Bryce and I's head, or whoever it is head, about how am I going to do this? What am I going to get? How am I going to approach it? Who am I going to use on the job? All that happens free of charge. And you don't have people on the clock trying to figure it out when you say go. So heads up, deliberate approach, good communication between, the Kyle of the project and the Bryce of the project. I mean, you need to be talking 2-3 times a week. There's nothing worse than when Bryce is running a job and he can't communicate with his client, and we're just out there trying to do the best we can. You need that communication, because the more informed your team is, the better, the more they're going to be able to be thinking proactively instead of just reacting to maybe what's in front of them. Kyle, we touched on a lot, man. Is there anything you want to leave us with? If not, it's okay. But I just want to say thank you for joining us, man.
No, I appreciate it. I think that maybe the last thing I would say is just make sure everyone understands your timelines, as far as what you're trying to hit, because you might start off somewhere thinking, hey, we got 30 days, but it could change on you quickly depending on what's going on or how many properties you have left to hit, et cetera. And so, yeah, talking to the Bryces of the world, as far as, hey, we might have 30 days, but I need this stuff in 25 days because I need days to assert defects. The whole point is communication is key. And if you can do that with whoever you're working with, you're going to set yourself up for success. But other than that, appreciate being on, guys. It was a good time, great conversation, and hopefully I'll be back.
Yeah, hope so.
Bryce, you got anything?
Yeah,
If anybody,
the one piece of advice I wanted to throw in there is
I thought I'd share this before we get off. We got merch for everybody that made it all the way through this episode.
That's
awesome.
I'm definitely going to need one of those. First order right here.
That's right.
First order. Sorry to cut you off, Bryce. Go ahead.
All good. It's worth it. Just, the one thing that I wanted to have is some of the best diligence projects we've worked with clients in hand. We have a clearly agreed upon a written list of objectives to accomplish during that due diligence. If it's an email, I'll say, we're going to hit these 10 things. We want to cover these 10 things during the scope of review. And even if it's just a framework of it, and there are things that happen underneath it. But, you, Kyle, as a client, or other clients that may want to do it, and us maybe as a broker, if we have our own list, like working up a list of objectives really goes a long way to getting everybody on the same page and ensuring a quality due diligence effort.
Absolutely. Due diligence, the Taco Bell of land work. T-shirts coming 2026, baby.
Great.
Awesome. Well, guys, really appreciate it. Good conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. First up.
Enjoyed today's topic? Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Learn more at dudley-land.com. See you next episode.